Yep. Recording in progress. And take off.
Prince. I think everybody knows quite well that at present we're engaged in the study of what we've come to call the higher evolution. I'm sure that it's also appreciated that we're studying this vastly important subject not in the abstract, not just in very general terms, but very much in the concrete, very much in particular terms. We're studying not just the higher evolution of man, but even the higher evolution of the individual. And this process, this whole process of the higher evolution of the individual is something very difficult, something very arduous, something involving a great deal of effort, a great deal of determination, even a great deal of strain, even, we may say, a measure at least of suffering. We may even go so far as to say that this particular type of effort, this particular kind of development, this higher evolution, is by far the most difficult thing that any human being, any man or woman, could possibly attempt. But even as it is the most difficult, the most arduous, it is also the most worthwhile. And being difficult, being arduous, being something that demands, we may say, everything that we have got, involving as it does every aspect of our nature, involving as it does a great deal of self-understanding, self-knowledge, a great deal of coming to terms with ourselves in various ways. We also find that in the course of this higher evolution of the individual, all sorts of difficulties, all sorts of problems even arise. Problems that demand to be resolved if further progress is to be made. And it's some of these problems, not just ordinary problems, ordinary difficulties, pressing as these sometimes are, but problems arising directly out of the higher evolution, directly out of our effort to evolve and to grow, that we shall be considering, or at least we shall be considering some of the more important of them in this course. Now, last week's lecture was the first of the whole series. So last week we didn't explore any specific problem. Last week we were more concerned with laying the general, we may say theoretical foundations for the whole course, concerned with coming to understand certain principles which would be applied in different ways, in different fields, week by week throughout the course. And we began by reminding ourselves very briefly of some of the things that we learned last year when we considered the higher evolution of man. We reminded ourselves, you may remember, about the universality of the great principle of evolution. We reminded ourselves of the nature of the distinction absolutely fundamental for this whole course between the lower evolution on the one hand and the higher evolution on the other. We saw again that the lower evolution is collective, whereas the higher evolution is individual, concerning the individual and his individual effort. Now, last week we were mainly concerned with the question of how consciousness evolves. And this was indeed the title of the lecture. And we were concerned with this question of the evolution or development of consciousness because the higher evolution of man, the higher evolution of the individual, consists essentially in an evolution of consciousness. So we saw last week that, broadly speaking, there are four different levels, four different degrees or grades of consciousness. And very briefly, these are simple consciousness or sense consciousness, that is to say, awareness of sensations experienced through the sense organs as a result of contact with the external world. And this type of consciousness we, of course, share with the animals. And then secondly, self-consciousness, which we also call subjective consciousness. Here, one is not just aware, one is aware that one is aware. One not only experiences sensations, feelings, emotions, and thoughts, and volitions, but is conscious of oneself as experiencing them. So this form of consciousness, self-consciousness, we do not share with the animals. This is distinctively human. And we are, in fact, only human to the extent to which this form of consciousness, self-consciousness, has been developed in us. Thirdly, transcendental consciousness, or what we also call objective consciousness, and this consists in the awareness of a higher spiritual reality, a reality which embraces both oneself and the whole of conditioned existence, the whole world. This higher spiritual reality is not in itself an object, but at this stage of our evolution, by means of this type of consciousness, transcendental consciousness, we experience it as an object, but in itself it transcends the subject-object distinction. Sometimes we also saw this kind of consciousness, this transcendental consciousness, is experienced as a sort of flash of insight that momentarily lights up, illuminates the whole of existence. And fourthly and lastly, absolute consciousness or universal consciousness, which is altogether beyond our present understanding, so that there's no point in saying anything at all about it. It's sufficient to indicate its existence as what we cannot but think of as the culmination of the entire process of the higher evolution. Now, having enumerated these four levels or degrees of awareness or consciousness, the simple consciousness, the self-consciousness, transcendental consciousness, and absolute consciousness, we went on to see that simple consciousness belongs to the lower evolution, whereas transcendental consciousness and absolute consciousness belonged to the higher evolution. And self-consciousness, we saw, the second degree or second level of consciousness, comes somewhere in between. Self-consciousness is the culmination of the lower evolution and the inauguration of the higher evolution, a sort of watershed between these two great divisions. We also saw last week, just to finish the recapitulation, we saw that the individual, in the course of his development, recapitulates the evolution, the development of the race to which he belongs. But we also saw that this principle applies only so far as the lower evolution is concerned. So far as the higher evolution is concerned, we are on our own. The lower evolution takes us so far and then leaves us there, deposits us there to struggle on our own by means of our own efforts. So further development, further evolution depends not on nature, not on nurture even, it depends on us, depends on our own individual effort. So we concluded by seeing, by understanding, that the immediate task before us, the immediate task before not just man, but the individual man, is to develop present, rudimentary self-consciousness to perfection, as well as to develop at least the beginnings of transcendental consciousness. And only if we are doing this, or at least trying to do this, perfecting our self-consciousness, beginning to develop our transcendental consciousness, only if we're engaged in this sort of effort, in this sort of work, can we be said to be leading truly human lives. So much then for last week's lecture and some of the main points touched upon therein. Not that in proceeding to this week's lecture, we leave last week's lecture and its subject matter behind. Not that we can afford to forget what we learned last week. The theoretical principles that we studied last week are like, we may say, the foundation of a building. And however high we may build, however many stones we may pile one on another, the foundation remains there all along. Now this week we come to the first of our problems. We come to a problem that, at least in the West, arises quite early in the spiritual life. At any rate, it arises quite early in the spiritual life of those who follow the path of Buddhism. And it's a very important problem indeed. It's all the more important inasmuch as it arises in connection with awareness. That is to say, arises in connection with self-consciousness. Awareness, as we saw last week and as we've repeatedly insisted on other occasions, awareness is the growing point of the whole process of the higher evolution. So that if there's any misunderstanding in connection with awareness, if any misunderstanding arises in connection with the practice or the development or the cultivation of awareness, then the whole subsequent course of the higher evolution may be affected, even perhaps made impossible. Just as if the bud is damaged, the flower will not be able to unfold, at least not to the full measure of its perfection. This is not awareness, is the resolution of many of our problems, integrating with and entitled problem. Now we're going to proceed slowly. We're going to proceed step by step according to the traditional Buddhist teaching. Here, many of us will find ourselves for a while on
This is proving a bit difficult, isn't it?
Voice keeps breaking up. It's stopped altogether now.
Who's actually playing this? Is it you, Savannah Beer?
I think
What's
we
happened to
lost
Savannah
Savannah
Beer?
Beard. I think that's the problem. It's his link is the problem, not the
Yeah, yeah.
He was frozen. It's colder in Moscow than he thought.
I thought he was just sitting still.
Maybe he'll come back. Oh, here he comes. Hello.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you froze and you're
I
still not
stopped
very
it,
clear.
so
Yeah.
hello. Shall I go onto my phone?
But I do think, well, if
suggest
you can
that
play
might
back
work
through
a
that.
bit better. Yeah. How am I now? Is it any better?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll try with this and let me know if it doesn't work or.
Detailed account of awareness in the sense of mindfulness along traditional lines in the first chapter of my survey of Buddhism. As perfect awareness, the seventh step in the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, I've dealt with this subject in the seventh lecture in the series on the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. I've also dealt with this subject of awareness or mindfulness in a more contemporary manner, also in a more comprehensive manner, in the course of a talk on dimensions of awareness. These talks, by the way, are all on tape. This evening, we've only time for an outline of the subject of awareness in general. Altogether, there are four main kinds of awareness, which we sometimes call dimensions of awareness. First of all, there's awareness of things. Secondly, awareness of self. Thirdly, awareness of people. And fourthly, awareness of reality. To begin with, awareness of things. This means awareness of the world around us, awareness of our material environment, if you like, awareness of nature. Now, if we want to be aware of something material in this way, we have first of all to look at it, or to listen to it, or perhaps both look at it and listen to it. But this is what very few people ever do. Most people, if they were asked, if they were challenged, they'd say that they've no time to look, really look, stop and look. No time to listen. But if we want really to be aware of things, material things, things which are parts of the world around us, parts of nature, we must learn to look at them. We have to learn to look, we may say, at the sky. Learn to look at mountains when we get the opportunity. Learn to look at trees. Learn to look at flowers, at rocks, at water, at fire, at all those, in a sense, very familiar material things that are all around us, that are there all the time, that in a sense we see all the time, but which at the same time we never see. Not only learn to look at these, as it were, more poetic things, but also learn to look at other material things that we encounter, that we cannot help encountering in the course of our existence, things even like brick walls and unemptied dustbins. Even at these, if they're around us, we have to learn to look. It's not only a question even of looking. It's not only just a question of using our eyes. We also have really to learn to hear, to taste, to smell, to touch. No doubt, the highest degree of perceptual awareness is possible through the sense of sight, through the eyes. But that does not mean that the other senses are not important or that they can be neglected. We should learn to look, moreover, not only at natural objects, not only at familiar household things of everyday use, but learn to look, really to look, for example, at works of art, paintings, sculptures, and so on. Things that very often, only too often, we just take for granted as parts of our cultural heritage, which we know are there in the museums and art galleries, maybe reproductions on our walls, but at which we don't really need to look, that we don't really need to see. We should also learn to listen to music. Lots of people just have music on as a sort of background noise to which they never actually listen. There's something there in the background. Whether it's Bach or whether it's the latest popular song, they don't really know. They have to stop and listen hard before they could tell you. It's just a sort of running rivulet of sound in the background without too much meaning or significance. But this is the sort of way in which awareness of things, awareness of the material environment, awareness of nature and of man's work, man's handiwork, to the extent that it is itself part of nature, in this way that it is to be developed. Now, secondly, awareness of self. Now, by this we don't mean anything very metaphysical. We mean simply awareness of the changing empirical self, which is in any case all that we usually experience. Traditionally in Buddhism, awareness of self is of three kinds, of increasing degrees of subtlety. First, there's awareness of the body and its movements, including the breathing process, on which, of course, there's a whole concentration technique based. Traditionally, it is told that as one is moving, if you're standing, be aware that you are standing. If you're sitting, be aware that you are sitting. Experience yourself sitting. If you move your hand, be aware you are moving your hand. If you close the door, be aware that you are closing the door. If you're holding a book, be aware that you're holding the book. If you're running, be aware that you're running. If you're talking, be aware that you're talking. Now, if we try to practice in this way, even for a little while, we shall very speedily become aware that we have sort of lapses of consciousness, lapses of awareness. There are whole periods, not to say tracts of time, when we don't really know what we are doing, in a quite literal sense. We don't know what we're doing with our body, if we are in fact doing something with our body. We don't know what happens to our hand. We don't know where it is or what it's doing. We don't even know where our head is sometimes. So this is the sort of teaching that traditionally we are given, that we should be aware of our physical body, be aware of its posture, be aware of its movements, and above all, in a sense, be aware of the breath. this most subtle part of the bodily function. Be aware of it coming in and going out, coming in and going out. Now, this is the simplest form of self-awareness. Just being aware of the physical body, being aware of your feet, being aware of your hands, and so on. But even though it's the simplest, it's still very difficult. And it's the foundation of all the rest, that is to say, all the other forms of awareness or mindfulness of self. And it's traditionally held that if you can't practice this, if you can't succeed in being aware of your physical body and its movements, it's not much use trying to practice any other more advanced form of awareness or mindfulness. And from Japan, there comes a little story to illustrate this point. It's a story, as so many of these stories are, about a young monk. And the young monk, we're told, went to an old monk because the old monk happens to be a great meditation teacher. And the young monk wanted to learn meditation. He wanted to become enlightened. So he made a long journey to the monastery where the old monk, the meditation master, lived. And after traveling for a long while, mostly on foot, very late at night, he reached his destination. During the last stages of his journey, it had been raining heavily. So he folded up his umbrella, put it to one side, took off his shoes, put them also to one side, and then he was ushered into the presence of the master. So he made his 3 bows, his 3 prostrations. The master asked him, "What have you come for?" He said, "Well, of course." So the master said, "Well, that's very good. Let me ask you a few questions." So the monk sort of sat back, the young monk sat back, getting ready to answer questions on Buddhist philosophy, logic, spiritual experiences, and so on. But all that the master asked was, "When you came here just now, what was the weather like?" You see, this is also a question that masters sometimes ask. People get very disappointed. They expect to be asked about nirvana and so on. But all that the master asked is, "Well, what was the weather like?" So the young monk, rather surprised, said, "Well, it was raining rather heavily." So the old monk said, "Oh, yes. And did you get wet?" He said, "Oh, no, I had an umbrella." So the old master said, "Well, where is the umbrella?" So the young monk thought to himself, "Well, this conversation is getting more and more ridiculous." But anyway, he politely answered, "It's outside. I left it outside with my shoes." So the old master thought a minute, then he said, "Tell me, on which side of the door did you leave your umbrella and shoes?" The young monk thought and thought, and he couldn't remember. So the old master said, "That won't do. Is that if you can't remember where you put them, where you left them, whether on the right-hand side of the door or the left-hand side, it means you just weren't mindful when you did it." So if you can't even practice mindfulness, how do you expect to practice meditation? How do you expect to gain enlightenment? You better go away. This is not the place for you. So the poor young monk had to depart. So this is a little traditional story illustrating this point, that awareness of the body, awareness of one's physical body and its movements, what it is doing, is the foundation of any subsequent higher practice of mindfulness and awareness. So I suppose you pass the test. Suppose you know where your umbrella is at this particular moment. But then you can go on to practicing awareness of feelings. Awareness of whether one's feeling tone, as it were, is pleasant, pleasurable, or painful, or whether you're experiencing a sort of grey neutral state. And from there we can go on to being aware of our emotions, being aware of whether we're experiencing love or hate or fear or anxiety or desire or hope or jealousy or delight or expectation or disgust, any other emotional state. When we experience it, knowing that we experience it. If we can do this, if we can be aware of our feelings, aware of our emotions, aware of our whole emotional life, then we shall find that this has a twofold effect. Our negative emotions will tend to be dissolved, and our positive emotions will tend to be refined still further. Or at least, even if the negative emotions are not dissolved, at least they'll be brought very much under control. Now, thirdly, there's what is known as awareness of thoughts. And here we become aware that very few people really think. Very few people are really masters of their thoughts. In most cases, thoughts just drift through our minds. Thoughts, as it were, take possession of us. We don't know why they've come. We don't know where they've come from very often. They just come, and here they are. And very often there's little we can do about it. We just have to tolerate them, even if we want to meditate and keep our minds free from thoughts. We just have to watch the thoughts, playing as it were, rioting as it were, in the playground of our minds. And it seems we're powerless to chase them away. But we don't think. We have no control over our thoughts. They're not our own thoughts, really. We're not masters of them. All that's happening is that we're subject to this very loose association of ideas, which is very easily interrupted, very easily redirected. But if we become aware of what is happening, if we cultivate this awareness of our thoughts, then thinking becomes more purposeful. In a sense, our thinking becomes our own. It becomes an active rather than a passive process. And what we call wandering thoughts gradually come to be eliminated, and we experience an altogether more peaceful and more harmonious state of mind. Now, this is the traditional classification of awareness of self, but it consists in awareness of the body and its movements, awareness of feelings and emotional states, and awareness of thoughts. But other classifications are also possible. We can speak, for instance, as I have done on a number of previous occasions, in terms of various kinds of psychological conditioning. By such conditioning, psychological conditioning, we mean the tendency of our actions to be determined without our realizing it by previous patterns of experience. In many cases, patterns laid down very early in life indeed. And this conditioning is of various kinds. We're conditioned by the fact that we are human beings and not animals. That is to say, we're conditioned by the fact that we are humanoid mammals as distinct from non-humanoid mammals. We're conditioned again by the fact of being either male or female. We're conditioned by the place where we were born, conditioned by our race, conditioned by our nationality. We're conditioned by the social group to which we belong, conditioned by caste, conditioned by class, conditioned by profession, conditioned by party, conditioned by church, even conditioned by religion. And such conditioning also is resolved through, by means of, awareness. In other words, awareness of self. To the extent that we become aware, really aware, that we're psychologically conditioned in all these various ways, to that extent, we become free, become emancipated from that condition. Now, thirdly, awareness of people. By this we mean awareness of people as people. And strange to say, that's a comparatively rare thing. Usually, we're aware of people not as people, but as things, as objects, as bodies out there. The extreme case, of course, is that of the infant. The infant is not aware, in the early months of life, even of mother as a person. In fact, least of all, of mother as a person. To the infant, mother is just an object that gives warmth, nourishment, and so on. Mother, to him, is just, we may say, a breast. Now, we like to think that we grow out of this sort of attitude towards people, regarding them as things. And to some extent, we do grow out of it, but not altogether. Only too often, unfortunately, in our personal lives, our personal relationships, we treat other people not as persons, but as things, as objects. No doubt all of us can think of many examples of this sort of thing. Now, we can't be aware of people unless we first of all look at them. And as many of you know, this is one of the things that we learn to do in our communication exercises, to learn to look at people. However, I'm not going to say anything more about that at the moment, because the weekend after the one that's coming, we shall be doing the communication exercises in a special weekend course. As I've said, only if we look at people can we be aware of them. And we can go even further than that, and we can say it's only if we're aware of people that we can love them. Now, fourthly and lastly, awareness of reality. And this is, of course, the highest kind of awareness. Not that this kind of awareness and the other dimensions of awareness are mutually exclusive. You can have glimpses of reality through all the others, through awareness of nature, awareness of the self, awareness of people. Through all of these, indirectly at least, we can have some glimpse of reality. But here, in this kind of awareness, awareness of reality is, as it were, direct. In what it actually consists, it's very difficult to say, because it's beyond words. But we can perhaps say that this kind of awareness is synonymous with meditation in the highest sense. That is to say, meditation as contemplation. Now, the four kinds of awareness, that is to say, awareness of things, of self, of people, and of reality, these four kinds or four dimensions of awareness are connected with the four kinds of consciousness. Awareness of things is connected with simple consciousness. Awareness of reality is connected with transcendental consciousness, both connected with self-consciousness. Now, we shall be dealing with the whole question of personal relationships and the higher evolution later on in this series. For the present, we're confining ourselves more or less to the subjective side, or to the more subjective side of self-consciousness. And this brings us to the next part of our lecture. Brings us to the nature of the difference between alienated awareness and integrated awareness. And here we come to the heart of our subject, the nature of the difference, the nature of the distinction between alienated awareness and integrated awareness. First of all, I'd like to point out that this is not a traditional distinction. This is not a distinction that one finds in Buddhist texts, in the Buddhist scriptures. It's not a distinction that is known in the East as such in Buddhist spiritual circles. This is not to say that the phenomenon of alienated awareness is unknown there. It certainly is known there, it certainly does occur, and I've had personal experience of it, I've personally encountered it in the course of my sojourn in the East. But we may say that this phenomenon of alienated consciousness, alienated awareness, is on the whole much more characteristic of the modern West. Why this should be so, we shall try to understand a little later on. For the moment, we're concerned simply to differentiate alienated awareness and integrated awareness. First of all, I must observe that integrated awareness is in principle identical with awareness in general, as we've just described it, especially with awareness of self. So the question to be answered is, what then is alienated awareness? What is it alienated from? What is integrated awareness? What is it integrated with? If we can only understand this, the nature of the distinction between the two will be clear. Briefly, we may say that alienated awareness is awareness of ourselves especially of our feelings and in ourselves, without actually experiencing our feelings and our emotions. So in its extreme form, alienated awareness is awareness of one's own non-experience of oneself, even awareness that one is not there, paradoxical as that may seem, awareness that one is not there. Now obviously this is quite a dangerous state to get in or to be in. Alienated awareness may also be accompanied by various physical symptoms. Especially, it may be accompanied by severe, even excruciating pains of various kinds in the head. This is more likely to occur when one is deliberately increasing alienated awareness under the erroneous impression that one is thereby practicing mindfulness. Now, I'm not, of course, saying that all pains in the head encountered in the course of meditation are due to alienated awareness. But pains, even very, as I've said, excruciating pains, are one of the physical symptoms of alienated awareness. Now, integrated awareness, on the other hand, is awareness of ourselves while at the same time actually experiencing ourselves. And this self-experience may be either positive or negative. But even if it's negative, the negativity will eventually be resolved by the fact that we are aware of the negative state besides actually experiencing or allowing ourselves to experience it. So the nature of the distinction between the two, between alienated awareness on the one hand and integrated awareness on the other, should be quite clear. Alienated awareness is that awareness which is alienated from experience of self, especially emotions. And integrated awareness is that awareness which is integrated with the experience of self, especially with the experience of the emotions. Now, I've said that this is clear, and no doubt it is conceptually clear, no doubt it's verbally clear, but perhaps it's still difficult for some of us really to recognize the distinction in a way that's meaningful, in a way that accords with our actual experience. So let's approach it in a somewhat different way. Let's now imagine three levels or three grades, as it were. First of all, there's experience without awareness. This is what we have most of the time. We feel happy, or we feel sad, we experience pain, or we experience joy, we experience love, we experience hate, fear, but we don't really know that we're experiencing. We're not aware that we're experiencing. This is the bare sensation, the bare feeling, the bare emotion. But there's no awareness. We're lost in the experience, immersed in the experience. We, as it were, forget ourselves. As when, say, we become very, very angry. When we recover, when we survey the damage, we say, as you were, well, I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't myself. I forgot myself. In other words, while we were under the influence of that emotion, possessed by that emotion, identified with that emotion or that emotional state, there was no awareness. So this is the first degree, the first level, as it were. There's experience. Certainly there's experience, no lack of that. That's there in full. But we're not aware of the experience. There's no awareness alongside it, no awareness of it. Secondly, there's awareness without experience. And this is the alienated awareness, where, as it were, stand back from our experience. It's not our experience, it's going on up there. So we're not really experiencing it even, not really feeling our feelings, not really emoting our emotions. We love, but we don't really love. We hate, but we don't really hate. We're sort of standing back and looking at the experience, looking at the feeling, looking at the emotion with this alienated awareness. So this is the second degree, the second level. The third is experience plus awareness. And this is what we call integrated awareness. Here we have the experience, and by very virtue of the fact that we're now experiencing integrated awareness, the emotional experience even tends to be a positive rather than a negative one. We have the experience, but alongside, or perhaps I shouldn't even say alongside, but as it were saturating the experience, in a sense even identical with the experience, we've got the awareness. The two have come together. So the awareness gives us, as it were, clarity to the experience. And the experience gives substance and gives body, as it were, to the awareness. So you've got both coalescing without it being really possible to draw a line and say, well, this side is the experience and that side is the awareness. You're fully immersed in the activity even, if the feeling or the emotion is accompanied by activity. You're fully immersed in the feeling or in the emotion in the sense of actually experiencing it, but at the same time, together with it, without being different from it, you've got the awareness. And this is a much higher state, a state that is very difficult for us to have any idea about if we haven't actually experienced it ourselves. This is not so much an awareness of experience, but an awareness with experience, an awareness in experience, even an awareness in the midst of experience. And therefore, as I've said, it is very difficult to describe it then. So perhaps we can approach the subject more conveniently in this way, thinking, as I've said, in terms of one, experience without awareness, which is our usual state, two, awareness without experience, or relatively without experience, which is our state when we get onto the spiritual path and sometimes go a little astray, and then thirdly, awareness with experience, experience with awareness, the two beautifully blended, as it were, together. Now, the question that we have to consider at this point, bringing us to part 3 of our lecture, is how does alienated awareness arise? How do we come, that is to say, not to experience ourselves? Now, we may say that this is due to some extent to the nature of the very times in which we live, especially here in the West. We're often told that we're living in an age of transition, and this is very true. Sometimes we don't realize how abrupt, even violent, how important also, how potentially valuable the translation is. Many of the old values are breaking up. People are no longer quite so sure what is right and what is wrong. Not quite so sure what they ought to do or not to. Not quite so sure how they ought to live, in what way they ought to live. Not sure what role to adopt, what part to play. And all this means that we're no longer sure who or what we are. Our sense of identity is weakened, and on this account there's a widespread feeling of anxiety. Now, I don't want to attach too much importance to this factor of the times in which we live. I want to look more closely at some of the more immediate factors. I've spoken of 3 levels of awareness of self, that is to say, awareness of body, of feelings and emotions, and of thoughts. So, in the same way, we can speak of 3 levels of experience of self, and even 3 levels of alienated awareness, or 3 levels of non-experience of self. First of all, non-experience of the body. There are several reasons for this. One of the most important is the refusal actually to experience, or to allow ourselves to experience, bodily sensations. Especially, we may say, sensations connected with sex. And such refusal is very often connected with wrong early training. In this way, one finds, for instance, that people are taught, or at least they're brought up with the idea, with the vague feeling, that the body is somehow shameful. At least it's not so noble as the mind, or so respectable as the mind. And in the same way, one is inculcated very often with the feeling, or with the idea, that sexual feelings are sinful. And all these sort of ideas, all these sort of feelings, we may say, are legacies, attitudes left over from Christianity. And though in many ways we might have outgrown Christianity, outgrown at least Christian dogma and ecclesiastical supervision, these sort of attitudes are very, very widespread and still do quite a lot of harm. And we may say that it's one of the great merits of the work of Wilhelm Reich that he's gone into this whole question, this whole subject, so very thoroughly, and has shown quite clearly how the inhibition, very early in life, even in infancy, of pleasurable bodily sensations could lead ultimately to a crippling negation on the part of the adult person of his or her whole life force. So this is non-experience of the body, and to some extent how it's come about. Then non-experience of feelings and emotions. This also comes about in various ways. We're told, for instance, or we've been brought up to believe, that certain emotions are wrong, especially negative emotions, and should not be indulged in. For instance, we're told that anger is wrong. It's wrong to get angry. So, having been taught in this way, we feel guilty if we happen to get angry or to become angry for any reason. So on this account, it sometimes happens that even when we are angry, we try to pretend that we are not angry. We refuse to recognize that we are angry. In other words, we repress the feeling, we refuse to experience it, and it goes underground. Then again, what happens is we experience an emotion, but we are told by someone in an authoritative position, that we do not in fact experience that emotion. For instance, mother tells the small boy that he is not afraid of the dark, because, she says, brave little boys are never afraid of the dark. So we want to be considered a brave little boy, of course. So we repress, we push, or we try to push out of sight our fear of the dark. In other words, we cease to experience the fear, at least cease to experience it consciously. It just gets repressed. And it may, of course, come out in dreams. We may have terrible nightmares. Or perhaps it happens that we just don't like our little sister. This is a very common family situation. But we are told by mother or by father that, of course, feeling, but we're told we don't experience it. Not even that we ought not to, but that we don't, that we can't, it's impossible. Like when the little boy sometimes blurts out, well, I'd like to kill Daddy. Huh? But mother says, well, of course you don't. No one would ever want to kill Daddy. That's psychologically impossible. You don't. So it's repressed. We cease to experience it. Or another common example, the little boy or little girl doesn't like brown bread. Huh? But mother says, well, of course you like it because it's good for you. Huh? So once again, confusion and repression. Huh? In this way, the child does become very, very confused indeed. In this and other ways, the child becomes alienated from his or her own feelings. And the effects of this may continue throughout life. Not only continue, but be powerfully reinforced from other sources. Because the same type of condition still goes on. When we're a bit older, maybe when we're adolescent, we discover we dislike going to parties. But we convince ourselves, perhaps, that we do like going because everybody likes going. So, of course, we do too. Or, we may say on another level, we discover that we're not in the least moved by the work of a certain famous artist. We may privately think it's just deplorable, it just leaves us cold. But we find that all our most intelligent friends are very much moved by the work of that great artist. In fact, they're highly excited about it. So we have to be highly excited too. Now, we need not multiply examples. The end result is that we become alienated to a greater or lesser degree from our own feelings and our own emotions. Now, non-experience of thoughts. Here, it's not so much that we fail to experience our thoughts. It's more like that we fail to have any thoughts at all. This is because we may say, nowadays, so many agencies are telling us what to think, telling us, in fact, what we think. Parents are telling us what to think. Teachers are telling us what to think. This isn't just a question of feeding us with information, with facts. That's all right, that's quite a different thing. But it's value judgments that are also imparted, that this is right and that is wrong, and this is good and this is bad, and so on. And then there's the various media, the newspapers, radio, television. They're also giving us information, yes, very slanted, very selective information, and also making up our minds for us about this, that, and the other, in a way of which practically all the time we're not really conscious at all. So having seen this, having made this little survey, we can begin to see what sort of state most of us are in, at least to some extent. We're in a state of alienation from ourselves, alienation from our own physical bodies, from our feelings, from our emotions, and from our thoughts. We don't experience ourselves. And this is something that we really have to recognize and really have to accept and really come to terms with, that we don't experience ourselves. Once again, we can think in terms of the iceberg. Just the tip protrudes above the surface of the waves. There's a whole mass of the iceberg below. So the tip is visible. The greater part of the iceberg is not visible. So it's just like that with our experience of ourselves. Our self is relatively extensive, just like the iceberg continuing underneath the water. But that part of the self, of ourself, which we experience, which we allow ourselves to experience, that we are allowed to experience, is relatively small. In some cases, it's even infinitesimal. So this is our condition. This condition of alienation from ourselves, our bodies, our feelings, emotions, thoughts. This is the state into which we've got ourselves, into which the world has got us, the age has got us, society has got us, our parents have got us, teachers have got us, and finally, we ourselves have continued the good work. So what happens next? what happens after this? Well, in the case of some people, in the case of some of us at least, we come into contact with Buddhism. We come into contact with Buddhism. And then what happens? When we come into contact with Buddhism, amongst all the wonderful things we start learning and hearing about, we start learning all about mindfulness and awareness. And what we hear, or what we're taught about mindfulness or awareness, seems to say that what we have to do is to stand, as it were, aloof from ourselves, especially aloof from our negative emotions, and not experience anything, just watch ourselves, just as we were watching, or just as though we were watching another person. This is what the teaching of mindfulness seems to say. So, of course, we are very much impressed by this, because in our alienated state, in our alienated condition, we can't help feeling, we can't help thinking that this seems just the thing for us. So we start practicing. We start practicing awareness, or practicing mindfulness, or what we think is awareness, what we think is mindfulness. We stand back from our thoughts, back from our emotions, back from our feelings, let's look at them, sort of push them out there. And what is the result? In 9 cases out of 10, in this way, we simply succeed in intensifying our experience of alienated awareness. Now, not only that, we learn other good things from Buddhism. We learn, for instance, that craving, desire, anger, and so on are all unskillful states. We're told we mustn't call them sins, because in Buddhism there aren't any sins. They're unskillful states, but they're just as bad as sins. If anything, they're much worse. And we've got to get rid of them. So we're very glad to hear this. We're very glad to hear. We think we're glad to hear, because we can't even really feel glad at this stage. But we think we're very glad to hear that craving and desire and anger and fear are unskillful states, because this means we're able to go on sweeping them all under the carpet and pretending that they aren't really there. And this too increases our alienated awareness. And later on still, when we start reading books about Buddhism and studying Buddhist philosophy, we come up against, or we come across, the anatta doctrine, that is to say, the doctrine of no self, or the non-self. And at this stage, if we're lucky, some smiling Oriental monk tells us that according to Buddhism, there is no self. The self is pure illusion. If we could only see clearly and see properly, we should see the self is just not there. We haven't got a self. That's our big mistake. And this too appeals to us very, very much. We rather like the sound of this teaching. Why is this? Because as the result of practicing mindfulness, so-called mindfulness, and increasing our alienated awareness, we've begun to feel rather unreal. And to us it seems, in our sort of experience of unreality of ourselves, it seems as though we've begun to realize the truth of unity. We've begun to have some experience of that great spiritual truth that there is no self. In other words, we start thinking that we've developed insight in the transcendental sense. And maybe the same smiling Oriental monk, not knowing anything about Western psychology or the mistakes that Western people can make, encourages us to go on thinking this. And the result is we just get more and more alienated. And we start feeling pains in the head. It seems sometimes as though our skull is being constricted, as though, some people have described it to me, there's a great iron band around the head. It's getting tighter, tighter, and tighter. And one is getting, and this is because one is getting just more and more alienated. And in some very severe, very extreme cases, people even have a complete mental breakdown. And in a very serious situation develops indeed. I may say that this is the sort of situation that I encountered when I came back to this country originally in 1964 from India. During the 20 years that I was in India, I had, of course, kept up some kind of communication with some Buddhists in this country, and I knew roughly what was going on, and I knew that there were one or two meditation centers and people practicing meditation, and I'd be pleased to learn this. But when I came back to England and started seeing things for myself, I found, in fact, that the situation was very different, and I got quite a shock. I remember one occasion I was taken to a certain meditation center. I'm not going to mention any names. And I was shown some people who were meditating, had been meditating for several weeks. And as I said, I had quite a shock because they seemed to me just like zombies. They just weren't there at all. They were so completely alienated from themselves. And I found quite a number of people in this state in London after having practiced mindfulness, awareness, and so on, in this sort of alienated way. They just made themselves mentally ill. And some of them had landed up in mental hospitals. They'd just been not meditating, but developing alienated awareness. Now, we mustn't think that this sort of thing happens only to those who take up Buddhism. It can happen to those who take up, in the wrong way, other forms of Eastern tradition too. Suppose your alienated person comes in contact not with Buddhism. Suppose he or suppose she comes in contact with Vedanta. Vedanta tells you you are not the body. It tells you you are not the emotions. You are not the mind. You are not any of these things. What are you? You are God. You are God with a capital G. You are Brahman. You are reality itself. You've just got to wake up to this fact. Don't think that you're the body. Don't think that you're the emotions. Don't think that you're the mind. Think that you are God. God, of course, doesn't have a body. So you practice in this way too. You say, I'm not the body. You're already alienated from it anyway, but you say, I'm not the body. I'm not the emotions. I don't have any emotions. I'm not the mind. I'm God. So what is the result? You just end up in the same way as with this wrong practice of mindfulness or awareness. You end up alienated from yourself. Now, this is not to say that the Vedantic teaching is wrong. It's not to say that the Buddhist teaching is wrong. The trouble is that we apply it wrong. Or sometimes we may say the Eastern teachers, even in the West, unacquainted with psychology, unacquainted with the Western mind, even they apply it wrongly. The teaching is metaphysically true. In a metaphysical sense, yes, there is no individual self. In a metaphysical sense, yes, you are God. But we don't take all this metaphysically, we take it psychologically. And in this way, all the harm is done. This way, the misunderstanding begins. So a strange sort of situation develops, a strange sort of pseudo-spirituality, and a strange sort of atmosphere in certain places. Go to some Buddhist circles, find the people on the whole quite mindful, quite aware. You know, they shut the door quietly, and they wipe their feet before they come into the house if it's a rainy day, and so on, and they don't get angry, or at least they don't show it. They're controlled, they're quiet, but everything seems a bit dead. They don't seem really alive. But what has happened? Why is this? Well, the reason is they've not developed integrated awareness. They've not, as it were, merged their awareness and their life principle, their aliveness. They've suppressed, they've repressed their life principle, and they developed this cold, alienated awareness instead of the real, true, integrated awareness. So another question arises, and this brings us to the fourth and last part of our lecture. How can integrated awareness be developed? Well, first of all, an in order to develop integrated awareness, we have to understand, at least theoretically, what has happened. We have to understand, at least theoretically, the distinction between alienated awareness on the one hand and integrated awareness on the other. We have to retrace our steps, we have to undo the harm that we've done or that has been done to us. We have to allow ourselves to experience ourselves. If we've once taken that wrong turn, if alienated awareness has really developed to any serious degree, then we have to go back to square one, as it were, and we have to learn, we have to allow ourselves to experience ourselves. We have to experience our own body, have to experience our own repressed feelings and emotions, have to learn to think, to insist on thinking our own thoughts. And this will not be easy, especially for those who are comparatively advanced in life, because some feelings are very, very deeply buried and therefore very difficult to recover. And we may even need expert, that is to say professional help in the matter. We may even have sometimes to act out our feelings, not only to feel them, not only to experience them, but express them externally, even sometimes the negative ones. This does not mean that we should indulge them, but it means that as it were slowly and mindfully, with awareness, we start letting them out and allowing ourselves to experience them while remaining conscious of them, aware of them, while we are actually experiencing them. Then if we do this, and other things as well, of the same nature, then we shall begin all over again to experience ourselves, begin to experience our own physical body, experience our own feelings, our own emotions, experience our own thoughts. In a word, as I said, experience ourselves, experience the whole of ourselves in our totality, the so-called good and the so-called bad, the so-called high and the so-called low, the so-called noble and the so-called ignoble. Experience it all as one living whole, which is ourself. And when we've done this, when we really experience ourselves in this way, fully and vividly, then we can begin to practice mindfulness. Because then, when we practice mindfulness this way, at this stage, it will be the real thing. It will be integrated, it will be integral awareness and not alienated awareness. And incidentally, I may add here that the communication exercises that I've already mentioned, and that we'll be having the weekend after this one, the communication exercises are very useful in this connection. Because one of the things that they do is to enable us to experience repressed feelings of all kinds, positive and negative, especially feelings directed towards other people. Now I hope that I've done, at least to some extent, what I set out to do in this lecture. I hope that the nature of the distinction between alienated awareness and integrated awareness has become, in some measure, clear. I hope it's clear how alienated awareness arises, also how integrated awareness can be developed. The whole subject is of very great practical importance indeed. As I've said, as in fact I've insisted, awareness is the growing point of the higher evolution of man, the higher evolution of the individual. But it's only the right kind of awareness, only integrated awareness, that constitutes this growing point, not the alienated awareness. So if we develop this, integrated awareness, mindfulness in the true sense, and if we continue to develop it on ever higher and higher levels, along with our experience on ever higher and higher levels, then we may say that the higher evolution, so far as we individually are concerned, is assured.
Thanks, Ivanovic.